Everybody's drifting in. Come and join us. I'm going to grab my papers. There we go. I want to welcome you all to the 10th of our series this year and announce that I meant to hand us, but we have a brand new schedule for next year, which will be on the web soon and is available as an email too. It's going out to the history department, but maybe not to all other parties yet. Today, I'm here to introduce Jim Webb, who is professor of history and director of African Studies at Colby, and spent 10 years at Hopkins doing everything from the beginning to end, or maybe a little longer. I don't know. That was
like 3.5.
And is the author of a series of classes, really. I mean, for many years I've been interacting with, I've read chunks of it. I can't say I've read the whole book, I'm sorry to say. But it's one of the great books if you are an American historian thinking about the origins of the slave trade and thinking about West Africa, which is desert frontier, ecological and economic change in the Western Sahel, 1600 to 1850, Wisconsin, 1995. Which was followed by a leap to South Asia in Tropical Pioneers, Human Agency and Ecological Change in the Highlands of Sri Lanka, 1800 to 1900. And now Humanity's Burden, which is somewhere around the room, a Global History of Malaria, which has come out recently from Cambridge in their Environment and Society series, and is literally that, a global history, a accessible, assignable global history of malaria, and in his paper today bears a relationship to the final chapters of that book, Malaria Redux: The History and Ethics of Malaria Eradication and Control Campaigns in Tropical Africa. Now we're going to have a comment today after Jim gives us a presentation of an outline in a sense, or a commentary where this sits. Allison Norris is an assistant professor of epidemiology here in the College of Public Health, and spent a long time in New Haven, getting all sorts of fancy degrees that we shudder to think at, and has done research in Africa, specifically Tanzania, but her work focuses on AIDS and gender-based violence, sexual and reproductive health, not exactly malaria, but she's an epidemiologist here to think about the campaigns, help us think about the campaigns against malaria in the second half of the 20th century. Great, Jim, thanks.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank John for the invitation to come to Ohio State. And it's a pleasure to be here in the School of Public Health, and I think that the paper I'm going to give today speaks to some of the concerns that people in public health have about disease control. So what I want to do today, I know the paper's been pre-circulated, although it's possible that not everyone here has read the paper. So I thought that I would talk a little bit about what's in it, and also begin with an introduction really to how the paper was written. As John mentioned, I've been working on the problem of malarial infections for a number of years, and I wrote a book that was a global history, and when I got to the final chapter, which is called Africa Redux, I was less satisfied with it than with the other chapters in the book, because there seemed to be less opportunity for original research. There was very little secondary literature. And so I felt that in parts of that chapter, I just ended up kind of summarizing what seemed to be known about malaria, the history of malaria in Africa. And after I published the book, or actually while it was in press, because I was trained as an Africanist and lived in West Africa for many years, I thought, well, really I should look into this further to see what evidence might there be. I really found it hard to believe that there were very few projects in sub-Saharan Africa. There's some that are quite well publicized, Garki project in northern Nigeria, project on the Kenyan and Tanzanian border. There were a few projects that were known about, but the overall picture that was presented in the scientific literature, and which is repeated to this day in the scientific literature, was that there really had been very little done in the way of malaria control in Africa during the early part of the 20th century, except perhaps in some towns and in some industrial settings, and that Africa had been largely excluded from the Malaria Eradication program, the first great project of the World Health Organization. And because Africa had been excluded, this was part of the rationale for launching a contemporary project in malaria control. Now it was Africa's turn, and there were funds available to do so. So I contacted the World Health Organization, and as fate would have it, there had been a recent change in the archival staff, and the person who had been running the parasitological archives, actually the broader archives of the WHO, had stepped down, and there was some new staff. And they decided to open the parasitological archives, which had not been opened before. So I was actually the first person admitted to the parasitological archives as opposed to the general archives. And in the parasitological archives, I just came across a rather vast amount of material. I mean, hundreds of boxes of material, much of it fragmentary, everything ranging from lab reports to larger project reports, correspondence from consultants who were visiting projects, and some of the ephemera of the projects and some of the detritus. So it wasn't easy to work with. So I spent, over the course of several years, I spent a fair amount of time working my way through the materials in the parasitological archives. And it's led me to the view that, in fact, Africa was not excluded from the malaria eradication program of the World Health Organization in 1955-1969. But in fact, there was a big effort launched in Africa that covered around 14 million people. And the effort was to develop protocols for eradication, and there was an understanding that protocols were going to have to vary by ecological zone. So there were projects launched in desert areas, in highland areas, in urban areas, and forest areas, and the like. And that there was an empirical record to be recovered from this rather extensive experience. As luck would have it, some of the more extensive materials and complete were those of some projects that were launched in Liberia. This is a little bit interesting because it turns out that the first large-scale, extensive use of synthetic insecticides was launched by the Americans, not by the World Health Organization, and not by the British in the colonial settings, or the French or the Portuguese. And that this was launched by the U.S. Public Health Service, and which of course morphed into the Centers for Disease Control. Interestingly, the people in contemporary malaria control at the CDC had never heard of the project and know nothing about it. So initially what I was working on was trying just to pull out the empirical evidence for the use of synthetic insecticides. And it turns out that there's a rather extensive experience, not so much with DDT, because in many areas of Africa, DDT turns out to be very little efficacious. And there's a turn almost immediately to other synthetic insecticides, particularly dieldrin benzene hexachloride. But throughout Africa, well, let's just say in Western Africa and in parts of Central Africa and in some parts of Eastern Africa, the experience is that synthetic insecticides produce rather rapidly resistance in the mosquitoes. And so the projects appear very promising at first, and there's a hope that it'll be possible to deploy synthetic insecticides in Africa, as we've done with some success in the Mediterranean. And if one applies them assiduously, it will be possible to reduce malaria transmission to zero, the holy grail of the malaria control programs. But in the event, it turned out that it was not possible to do so. It was possible to reduce levels of transmission to very low levels, and to reduce infections by 98% or 99%, but it was not possible to get to zero. So in the 1950s, the project managers decided that they would embark on an auxiliary program which would involve population-level use of chemotherapeutic agents, and they attempted to dose populations with chloroquine or with pyrimethamine to see if it was possible in combination with IRS, indoor residual spraying, to drive the levels down to zero. This also proved elusive, and they didn't get to zero. And because the expense of these projects was relatively high, and for a variety of different reasons, including the fact that many of the West African building materials contained lateritic soils which were sorptive and which drew some of the residual insecticides away from the surface of the buildings into the interior and rendered them less potent than they would have otherwise been, that I just completely lost my train of thought here. So come back to me. I was talking about this. Let's see. That the experience with residual insecticides and in combination with chemotherapeutic treatments turned out not to be able to achieve the goal. And they're relatively expensive. And the result was that project managers realized that they were not going to be able to continue because most of the returns, the economic returns or the gains in reducing mortality and morbidity accrued during the early years of the projects, so that you made an initial investment, you could drive the levels of infection fairly low, and you continued on for 2 or 3 years, and you got the levels down to 5%. If you push, you could get them down to 2%, or push, you can get them down to 1%. But most of the gains were realized in the first year or two of the project, but the recurrent costs were high, so they were understood to be not sustainable. And so when the projects were closed down, the populations that had been protected by these interventions were subject to epidemic malaria, because in the interim they had suffered or experienced the degradation of their immunological status, and they were no longer able to handle the infections as well as they did otherwise. And this was well known within the World Health Organization. They knew that after every one of these projects ended that there was going to be epidemic malaria, sometimes considered rebound malaria. And the idea that was held by the malariologists, at least as far as I can tell on the basis of interviews with now an elderly generation of malariologists who were active in the program, the view was that, well, malaria was returning to a pre-intervention equilibrium, that of course it was extremely unfortunate that populations would suffer epidemic malaria, but it couldn't have been any worse than it would have been if they hadn't intervened to begin with, and that was kind of the rationale with which they assuaged their concerns. Well, we know now that some of the experience in the community subject to epidemic malaria was that, in a sense, there was a cost shifting into different age cohorts, so that adults who had had robust immunological responses to repeated infections and had lost their immune status or had it degraded were subject to more severe malaria than, at least in some areas, like in Nigeria, according to Bruce Quat, one of the great malariologists of the mid-20th century, they were subject to severe malaria that had rarely, if ever, been documented before. What came out of the Liberian materials was a similar kind of story, that there was severe epidemic malaria, that the WHO sent teams down to investigate and try and intervene, but they determined that there was, in fact, no feasible way to intervene. On the basis of spleen palpation, which is something that you do usually with kids, but could be done in adults who had lost their immunities, the teams down there were agreed that there was a severe epidemic affecting adults that was in progress. So the significance of this research, which might seem to be, well, evidence from the 1950s or the 1960s, and to not have much direct bearing on the present, I think that the meaning of it is that it's in fact directly relevant, because contemporary control or elimination or eradication, depending on the discourse, that's in progress now in Africa, in tropical Africa, is using many of the same tools, has the same basic tool set. In fact, some of the same insecticides are being deployed in the exact same areas. And when I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago at the CDC to the entomologists, they were astonished because they always said, this is exactly the experience we're having now. Yeah. So it kind of made sense. They were using the same tools in the same areas. So for me, the ethical issues that come up are those that really can only be elucidated by historical epidemiology. That is to say, to look into the past experience of these populations in project zones and see what their experience with an increased mortality burden has been. This is something that people in contemporary control are completely unaware of. And the response from people in control, both at CDC and, for example, President's Malaria Initiative, is the same. It's like, oh, we didn't know about this. Oh, okay, well, we definitely have to take this into consideration. Oh, we'll have to have intervention strategies for when we do wind down the insecticide spraying programs, because the insecticide spraying programs are running into resistance, just as they did in the 1950s and the 1960s, and it's clear that it's not going to be possible to sustain them. Control has been very good in some areas. In those areas where it has been very good, people have had their immune status degraded, and we're on, at least we have the potential of entering into the same set of problems with human health that we had in the 1950s or 1960s. So to me, this kind of work seems to me to be extremely practical, directly related to contemporary control. I think in a larger sense, it highlights one of the vulnerabilities of contemporary public health work, which is that it's largely ahistorical, and that within the discipline of public health, there is no sustained effort to try and understand the historical epidemiology of some of the major infections. And what I would argue in this paper and elsewhere is that it is directly related, and in fact, the lack of attention to historical epidemiology constitutes a significant public health risk that is borne by populations that public health specialists are engaged in helping. So that's, I hope, a little bit provocative to a public health audience, and a little bit about what's in this paper on the history and ethics of malaria eradication and control campaigns. So if that's the end of it, I'll turn it over to my commentator here, Allison.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you all thank you for inviting me to provide a commentary on Jim Webb's paper. I think I was asked by Chris and John to comment on this paper because I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist. They had no idea of my personal history with malaria. I have lived in Zanzibar, Tanzania, for many years, where malaria is endemic. And my formative experiences in public health and in medicine in the early 2000s include working on one of the early studies on combined therapy for treatment of malaria, and also working as a medical student in the main public hospital in Zanzibar, where I participated in the care for children who were dying from cerebral malaria and from severe anemia. And my connection to malaria control goes back a bit further to 1994, when I lived in the house of a man called Salim Doctor. Salim Doctor was renowned throughout Zanzibar as one of the foremost experts on malaria. And Salim, not actually a medical doctor, had been hired and trained as a laboratory technician in the 1980s during what eventually became a failed malaria eradication program in Zanzibar. So Jim's paper sets out to do two things. First, the paper describes the arc of efforts to eliminate malaria from Africa in the 1950s and the 1960s. As he's detailed, the elimination efforts include new types of medicines and modes of distributions of those medicines, and new insecticides for mosquito control. The malaria control programs had varying levels of success, and Jim points out that protection was purchased at the expense of immunity. This idea that repeated exposures to malaria, which results in either acute infections or a subacute infection, where the person has an infection but doesn't feel ill, leads to a future partial immunity. And subsequent infections are not as serious. So in communities where people were protected from malaria for several years, they lose this partial immunity and they become far sicker when they are re-exposed to malaria. And the second thing that the paper does is it evaluates the causes and the consequences of the failure to eradicate malaria and the closure of these projects years to decades later. Folded within these failures is the argument that malaria control efforts.
Senegal down to, say, the Cameroons. I've traveled the entire region, as well as many other parts of sub-Saharan Africa. We were accused, i.e. the sub-Saharan or the Africans, I don't know which unit of analysis one can use, as Alison points to, of having too many children. So the question becomes, why do we have too many children? Because children are valuable for economic reasons, for old age care, for replacement, etc. The notion of reincarnation, and therefore children choosing to stay or leave, is where the corrective is. There is a cycle of life within the African epistemology. The children who reincarnate, or the spirits that reincarnate, are reincarnating because they fail to fulfill certain functions that they intended to fulfill while they were alive. And in a sense, this is not really unique, unless one wants to really believe that reincarnation within Christianity occurred only once, i.e. Christ, and case closed. But if we can stretch our imagination, this goes beyond the African or the West African context. And so children are so valuable that we have to look at the point at which they became nearly irrelevant, so to speak. Pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial, on the one hand. On the other hand, the perspective from which the West, especially Americans, see Africans, given the racialized notion or racialized nature of American society. How do you see me when you see me? Makes a great deal of difference. The question of ethics, if this can be instituted as global governance markers, you will find that you will not attempt to end malaria, mosquito bites, as Alison said, without engaging the people. You'll engage the people, and if you choose to end malaria bites, there are consequences of failure if you fail. I mean, let me put this in a different context. Look at all that you said in your paper, you captured what happened in the 80s in Africa. The deliberate dismantling or emancipation, if you will, the weakening of the African state and therefore their capacity to carry out healthcare policies, the so-called structural adjustment policies. No one in the World Bank, no one in the IMF is held accountable for those policy failures. So I wonder if we go back, you said CDC did not even know that these programs existed. And I'm thinking about other programs that happened in the United States that had to do with the healthcare system. For example, the Tuskegee experiment. I begin to wonder, what were these policies aimed to do? Were Africans experimented on? And if so, who is going to be held accountable? My best friend, I am a Nigerian from eastern part of Nigeria. My best friend died at age 104. And he narrated to me some of the things that happened. Not educated man. This person came from here, this person came from here, they tried this here, they tried this there. Nobody's held accountable. Just like nobody's held accountable to the number of policies that have been implemented on Africans. So it's really important going forward that we take seriously this notion of our common humanity. Because in the global context, I personally don't see it. Because there are still those old misperceptions that often have become normal with serious implications for healthcare, public policy, in economics, etc. Thank you. My question to you is it's a simple question because I didn't have the dates. Do you remember when the US carried out the experiment in Liberia? Do you remember what year?
Yes, 1945.
1945, thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, so thank you very much for that intervention. And I agree with you that many of the global actors seem to be operating without much accountability. I mean, one of the working title I have for this book is In the Shadows of Immunity. And the immunity is double-edged. One is this issue of acquired immunity to malaria, and the other is immunity from any type of prosecution or immunity for being held accountable for some of the actions. So I certainly agree with you on that point. In terms, and I'm interested in what you have to say about children, I mean, the point that I was making is that at least the anthropological literature, well, maybe I should just put it like this, if I didn't earlier. It seems to me that in basically all human societies, until very, very recently, people have always had a lot of children for the very reasons that you put forward, and that they're considered valuable. But if a community or if a family was looking at the loss of an adult, a spouse, as opposed to a newborn, then in that sense, the adult is more valuable. And I think it's been true. It's not something that's particular to Africa or West Africa. I think it's universal. And I think that that's not part of thinking in the West, because we now live in a very different world than all of humanity up until a couple of hundred years ago. And that the calculus that we use is not a calculus that's shared by a lot of people in the world who are living in different circumstances. Which isn't to say that children aren't valuable or children aren't loved or children aren't wanted. It's simply to say that economically productive members and people that you love and that are adults and who are participating. This is why in the paper I put part of the moral quandary was that it was undoubtedly noble to save the life of a child, but what was the moral calculus when rebound malaria would cost the life of the mother or the grandmother? And instead of saying, oh, it's all equal, I don't believe it's all equal, and I don't think it's ever been all equal in human history up until very, very, very recently, and in some societies where we're so wealthy that we don't have the same kinds of assessments.
Just very briefly, I didn't intend to say in Africa we see children as equal to adults. My point is the valuable. And so the only way a family will really deal with the loss is to hope for the future. Clearly, adults, because of their responsibilities, probably are, if you want to look at it in terms of, okay, who is more valuable, it really depends on families. But as a community, we mourn a child just like adults are celebrated when they pass. And it's the absence of public health, I would argue, the absence of clinics, the absence of viable preventive medicine that in some situations that the perception can be maintained that sub-Saharan Africans or West Africans do not value children. No.
I see what you're saying.
I think just to pick up on, I think the point here and the point raised about agency, we can also, we decry the kind of neoliberal shift and the weakening of states, but another important shift that happens with this is imagining people not as Africans, but as consumers. And this allows a different, it gives us a kind of agency, one that we might not all agree with and has its own set of problems, but this also gives rise to things like social marketing. You see this around HIV with condoms, social marketing with condoms, but also the same way with bed nets and these kind of things. So imagining consumers, but in this case Africans, as people who can solve their own problems, not as something that should be happening at the state level or the international level. So I think, so you're in the shadow of immunity. I feel like also this idea of in the shadow of the state. What I can tell reading your paper is this a kind of genealogy of the weakness of the colonial and the post-colonial state and its inability to pursue its projects? Or, so what does the malaria tell us about that? But I think that this neoliberal moment does create a new kind of agency, or gives Africans a kind of agency that colonial and even post-colonial states didn't necessarily do. So I think maybe that people wouldn't agree with that. I think it's a way of thinking about it.
This is going to pick up on the theme of agency. It's actually going to get back to Alice's question, so it's going to be more like a plea for you to answer it, I guess. But I was reading through this paper, and the thing that struck me is that you have a lot of agency here, but the agents I didn't see were actual Africans as laborers, patients, consumers, members of communities, and their role in actually shaping the implementation of some of these campaigns. And I was just wondering if maybe you could talk about it a little bit, if that's something that you feel you want to address in this book. Because it seems to me that would actually, play a role as well in the story.
Sure. Well, I think that it's true that there aren't African voices in this paper, and it's largely a function of the sources that I'm using. The World Health Organization projects, the colonial projects, were not at all concerned with African perceptions of the projects and did not take them into account. So that the African agency that shows up in the reports is kind of on the margins, where you have, for example, in Liberia, you have some control zones, but then you have, this is in kind of upland Liberia, then you have lots of traders and family members from Guinea who are crossing the border and who are parasitized, and all of a sudden it's really problematizing for the interventionists the idea that they're kind of discrete zones that can be zoned off, and we can just practice, you know, our magic on this area, and oh my gosh, no, there are people moving in from the outside, and they're confounding the situation. So we have lots of examples from, you know, the SALT projects that were developed. You know, there was this idea that one way to intervene at a population level was to lace salt with chloroquine, on the thinking that everyone used salt. And before there was any empirical study that showed that, in fact, some people use little salt, some people use a lot of salt. And there was the prospect of both underdosing and consequently speeding up resistance to the antimalarial, or running the risk of overdosing for people who used a lot of salt. But it turned out that people were just not interested in using the salt that had been doctored in this form, and so this was another type of either non-use or resistance, depending on how you wanted to think about it. I mean, in a general way, I think people globally have been really interested in having indoor residual spraying for the first few years, because it takes care of a lot of vermin, it takes care of mosquitoes, takes care of a lot of things that people don't like living with. And it's only when you get resistance on the part of the vermin, typically even before the mosquitoes, and it no longer works, then people are not interested in, or there's less interest in continuing with indoor residual spraying.
So maybe just as a little bit follow-up, the same section where you discussed the assault measure, you actually make allusion to health propaganda, though. And I mean, when I'm thinking of health propaganda, I mean, you're saying that they're taking very little interest in Africans' response to it, but in order to actually construct a successful health propaganda campaign, it seems to me that you would actually have to adapt it to certain practices or perceptions in a local community. So I'm wondering if there's more evidence of those types of campaigns, and if those might actually give you some insight into responses to communities.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think the short answer is not in that era, so that it would certainly be completely necessary if you were going to have an effective health propaganda program. And these were not particularly effective for just that reason. That it's later, in later years, by the time you get to the 70s and 80s, that there's a kind of broader appreciation. And there are many more Africans who are trained in biomedicine and who are participating in raising these kinds of issues. And so you start getting much more culturally intelligent types of health outreach. But I wouldn't say that that would be something that you would find in the 1950s and 1960s in tropical Africa. I mean, in Liberia, you know, the work that's being done in the upcountry is in populations that are non-literate, so that, you know, the health propaganda, they're passing out newspapers that have photographs of mosquitoes and drawings that are trying to explain the cycle. But it's not something that I can, as far as I can tell, that people can make head or tails out of. It's certainly not going to be something that influences their behavior. Well, I guess there's a question behind me.
Thank you. So, you know, one of the things that you said just as I walked in, I walked in a little bit late, and I see it also in the paper that, you know, the malaria control or public health strategies to try to address malaria in part is suffering, and the African populations are suffering because we haven't learned the lessons of history. And I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more specifically how that is playing out, and if there are also contemporary examples in the Western world, in the United States, for instance, where you see some of those same dynamics of lessons, failed learned lessons. And that might be a question for you also, Allison. I mean, the ethical issues clearly are present, but I'm just wondering, to what extent are we suffering from not having fully grasped the lessons of history and malaria specifically?
Well, I think that the question of lessons from the past is a little difficult to address, surprisingly. I mean, in part because we just take malaria. I mean, malaria is a set of infections that occur in microenvironments with all of these different variables. And so what was known and widely accepted in malariology in the early part of the 20th century was that all malaria was local, and that the only way to really successfully intervene was through local epidemiology. This was biblical knowledge. Then there was a mathematical moment in the 1960s, and it was believed that the dynamics of malaria could be reduced to mathematical formulae, and because you could understand it and you could model it, you could intervene, and that local epidemiology wasn't important. And not only local epidemiology wasn't important, entomology wasn't important, because if you had something that worked, who cared which mosquito it was, or what were their microbehaviors, or it was just all unimportant. You could have a single model that you could develop and that you could roll out across.
And it was largely medicine-based?
It was initially insecticide-based, and when that failed, it was conjoined with medicine. And when that failed, there was an abandonment. And then we have now had a new moment in the late 20th century, or early 21st century, where we are now once again in the thrall of the idea that there is a single model that we can embrace and we can roll out across Africa, and that local epidemiology is not important and entomology is not important. What's important is, you know, this grand idea. So I think that all health interventions ought to be informed by historical epidemiology. It's not a question that it's something malaria specific or tuberculosis specific or diarrheal disease specific. The idea that you are intervening in an environment that has been intervened in before, and yet you are completely unaware of what has happened, is, well, let me put it a little polemically, highly irresponsible. And I think that it is, it's one of the principal failings of public health. I think that in a generation this will be addressed. I think within 10 or 15, 20 years we will have historical epidemiology integrated into schools of public health, that the idea that you could teach public health completely unaware of what had taken place in the past and the consequences of those interventions will be seen as absolutely foolish.
I really agree with you. I mean, I think And that there are so many other examples, I think, in history of, you know, infectious disease and chemical exposures that don't necessarily get brought into our curriculum.
So I feel like I want to push back and say, we teach the history of these things, but maybe it's just I do. Like, I care about the long story of these things and wouldn't think about teaching malaria without talking about when was, like, the time before people knew what the vector was. But that maybe I'm closer to you than to a malariologist after all. But I think that this problem of ignoring stories of the past is widespread and is broad, but broader than public health. It's the kind of model of development. That you look only at this moment and think about the economic development or the health, certainly, social, educational, right, that these people have an impulse to do something that is good and could probably be described as good, but do it acontextually without considering the phenomenon that have been in place in that context for a long time. I'm thinking, well, we'll just change it to make it be better at this good thing instead of whatever it's been, who cares, we're going to make it something better. So the thing that I, again, maybe being optimistic, but the thing I would like to think has changed is the question of ethics and whether public health campaigns have quite the carte blanche to go in and do what they want without some resistance from local government. There's certainly resistance from people, from participants who are suspicious of, perhaps even of their own government, but suspicious of interventions that have not delivered on the promises in the past. And so there is often I think there often has to be a more convincing tale told by the intervener before the intervention can be launched. So I still wonder this sort of fundamental question, which is, if people really believed their interventions were going to work, were they wrong to pursue them? They were, in the end, wrong. They were wrong. They were incorrect, but were they morally wrong to pursue them? Because they couldn't have anticipated the degree of the failure, because they didn't think they were going to fail to eradicate. It's a puzzle, right? We know they failed. So we look back and say, you shouldn't have done this because the rebound effects, etc. But if they, anyway, I'm stuck there.
Let me address that point first. In 1950, in Kampala, was the first World Health Organization conference on African malaria. And they brought together specialists from, largely from Europe, some from the United States, some from Africa, Togba from Liberia, to try and determine if the new synthetic insecticides ought to be deployed in rural Africa. And the problem was always rural Africa. It was possible to control malaria in urban areas and in some mining areas, plantation areas, but across the continent, it hadn't been. Were these new tools going to be effective? There was a heated debate at Kampala which rent the malariological community. And on one side was some notable malariologists, Swell Grebo, who chaired the committee, is one of the great malariologists of the first half of the 20th century. And that group believed that interventions would compromise the acquired immunities of Africa, and that there could potentially be a disastrous circumstance if the interventions lapsed. The majority position was that they should go ahead. And famously, Bruce Quat of London School clasped his hands and said, "Let us spray." So the risk, at least for the dissenting minority was palpable. The division was so great that there were malariologists who never spoke to each other again, including those who work on the same hall in the London School. It was the fundamental issue. One of the compromises that came out of Kampala was that if any intervention were to be undertaken, then there ought to be a program for intervention if things went bad. That was never done. And it was never done. I mean, that lapse was a repeat lapse. So that these projects went on and there was never an effort to intervene, which is one of the reasons that we actually know so little about acquired immunity, and the data are in fact very, very difficult of interpretation because there's a moral obligation to treat. And if you have people who are suffering from rebound malaria, you can't just sit there and watch them and count them to see who's going to die and who's not going to die. You have a moral obligation to treat. And if you're not there, or you run away from the situation, then you don't know what's happened, which is pretty much what was going on. The one exception to this was at the project that was on the Kenyan-Tanzanian border, where they stopped the intervention and then they watched. But at that time, this was in the early 60s, at that time there was a lot of chloroquine circulating, and so that people were able to self-medicate. And there were still elevated deaths among younger populations, but it undoubtedly was not as severe as it would have been otherwise. Yeah. I mean, I think that there aren't like a set of lessons out there to be consulted. It's more of a dynamic kind of issue, that when you're looking at a certain type of intervention that you're planning, you have to consult past projects to see what actually worked, and it gives you a sense of what the possibilities might be and what you ought to be planning for example, in acquired immunities. There's so few people working in historical epidemiology, it's amazing. And I was reading an article the other day about mass population interventions, both prophylaxis and curative. There were 3 projects that were undertaken in sub-Saharan Africa at population level. I said, well, wait a minute. I looked at my desk. I have 18 projects on my desk. So there is a wealth of empirical evidence and that can inform the present and that can inform policy making. And it's not consulted. It's kind of like, well, if it isn't in PubMed, it don't exist. Well, that's a kind of fundamentally ignorant and irresponsible position to take.
I have a question about your sources, not to go back 3 questions ago. But you guys keep saying that history is so important and nobody's consulting history, and I totally agree. But, you know, the 1950s is not that long ago. I mean, regardless of what my undergrads think, those people are still alive. So what about some oral history?
Yeah, sure. I mean,
My landlord, Solemn, that guy likes to talk.
He likes to talk. No, I've done some interviews, you know, particularly with people who were in malaria control. Yeah. No, I think it's an important resource for sure.
Just a short story to illustrate what the question she just asked. I was invited to give a paper at the Harvard Africa Development Conference March this year. And one of the keynote speakers, Tito Mbawani, who is former governor of the South Africa Reserve Bank, very well-known, powerful guy. One of the lines he used was that after he retired, he went up to Malawi with some of his friends where they normally would go fishing. And they got there, they couldn't catch much. And so they started wondering, talking to people, how come, where are the fish in this river? And they said, oh, the malaria mosquito nets came, and so we used them to catch the fish.
And of course, and there's a lot of insecticide that's being released through that use as well.
In the water.
In the water.
Which goes to your argument, one of your arguments about this distribution of medications to people who don't read the instructions, do not know how to take it, you just leave it with them, and issues of toxicity and underuse all crop up to create all kinds of problems.
Absolutely.
One of the issues you probably are familiar with is the alternative interpretation of learning from the past, and that is that insecticide resistance didn't come primarily from indoor spraying, but from the massive amounts of DDT, which was the cheapest effective insecticide ever invented, was sprayed by the ton over agricultural areas, which the mosquitoes were breeding in, and of course causing resistance of all kinds of insects at the same time. So it becomes a nasty, uncontrolled, independent variable that's going on at the same time in the early efforts of the WHO program right after the war and following up through the end of the 60s. Do you have an answer to that kind of counter-argument?
Sure. I mean, I think that DDT use was largely, globally, largely for agriculture. That's pretty well established. Maybe 80%, maybe 90%. It was certainly used in a profligate manner in the United States, which is why we had Silent Spring. And it was used in a profligate manner in some areas in South Asia. Within Africa, we don't have very good evidence for DDT use. At this time, when DDT, for example, in the 40s and 50s is just being introduced, and I happen to know the Liberian data perhaps better than some others, I mean, there is no DDT use except for indoor residual spraying in the upcountry. That's all there is. And yet you're getting the emergence of resistance right away. And I think that's broadly true for the project areas. And yeah.
So that's a pretty solidly established fact that even where it wasn't being used for anything except mosquitoes, resistance still came fast.
Yes. Yes.
Because I've heard that when the South Americans are arguing with the Africans back and forth, which they've been doing for the last 10 years, it seems, about whether we should go back to DDT. And the Africans say yes, and partly using that argument, so it's a false.
Well, it's certainly the case that in the earlier campaigns in the 50s and the 60s, we have the emergence of resistance absent agricultural uses of DDT. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Including in urban areas.
Yeah.
One of the things you raised a lot, you raised it again here just a few minutes ago, was about we don't know enough about the science of losing resistance and how that happens. You have these rebound epidemics. And I wondered, if you were talking to young scientists today, what would you want to know about the human immune response? What would you want to ask them to study in particular? Sort of how would you, what experiments would you want? What would you want to know about it, about the human response, immune response that you don't?
Well, I think that
It's a wish list.
yeah, I think that how I would respond to that is I don't want to see any type of experiment on the human immune system through the introduction of infections. I think that what's being done in some labs, including at NIH, is that from my point of view, one of the more promising approaches to vaccines are those that stimulate the immune system in order to provide partial immunity to infection, so that then when other infections are incurred, they're of lower severity. So the idea isn't to prevent infection or to have some type of prophylaxis that will prevent the plasmodium from going through a life cycle, but simply to stimulate the immune system. That seems to be the most promising approach. And I guess I'd like to see more research on that. It's not something that has the same kind of emotional purchase as other approaches, because in the same way that we're seduced by the idea of eradication, we want to do something once and for all. We want to have a 100% effective vaccine that's going to just stop kids from getting malarial infections. And I think that's not a realistic approach. Whereas I think that if there's some way to artificially stimulate the immune system and provide a heightened level of protection, and it might be a once-off kind of operation, unlike contemporary vaccines that are going to have at least 3 stages and then only give you 50% protection. That seems like a very promising way to go. But I think that it's harder to sell because it doesn't appeal to us emotionally like eradication or the 100% solution. It's something where you're admitting that, okay, well, we're going to have continuous infections. We're not going to solve the malaria problem. What we're going to do is we're going to improve child survival enormously, and we're going to prevent a lot of the really serious sequelae from these initial infections.
This question and what you said prompted me to wonder, I don't know whether this question reflects a kind of American parochialism or not, but this is a country, the United States, which in more recent times at least, has talked about things like a war on cancer, a war on drugs, which to me reflects a kind of extraordinary hubris that's unreasonable. And I gather that's a point of view that you to some degree share. What I wonder is this attitude particularly prominent in the United States? Do medical and epidemiological communities in other places approach things that way? You know, we're going to eliminate cancer, we're going to eliminate this, as opposed to controlling, managing, and so on.
I don't think that's a public health point of view. I think that's a political slogan.
No doubt it
Generates
is,
money.
but is this kind of thinking prominent elsewhere?
Well, certainly in the 1950s and 1960s, there was an international community that was intoxicated by the idea. So, you had French malariologists and Spanish malariologists and Indian malariologists and Liberian malariologists who were very, very taken by this. I can't speak to more recent times and to know whether I don't have any knowledge of that.
And just related to that, really, I mean, at the same time as eradication is desperately hubristic and all the rest, rinderpest was sort of eradicated broadly, contemporaneously. Am I correct?
Rinderpest was just eradicated a year or two.
Right. So over the periods, sort of the last sort of 30 years or so, there has been a disease which has been responsible for enormous amounts of economic problems in Africa, eradicated. Smallpox has been eradicated. So I wonder whether the successes in these two unusual, isolated cases is fueling excessive optimism elsewhere, and what is distinct about those cases and what makes those unreplicatable elsewhere.
Well, I think that's a really interesting set of relations, and I mean, smallpox and rinderpest are both viral diseases, and it turns out we've had a pretty good track record of developing antiviral vaccines. We don't really have any human antiparasitic vaccines, so that's a problem. But in terms of the relationship between these campaigns, it's pretty interesting. The malaria eradication program of the World Health Organization from 1955 to 1969 was such an embarrassment for the WHO that they resisted the smallpox eradication campaign. They wanted to have nothing to do with it. And if you read D.A. Henderson's memoirs, I mean, it was just quite a feat to kind of do end runs around the WHO in order to get funding and so forth, because they were not interested in it. I think that for the current campaign, it remains a little bit mysterious. I mean, in 2007, when Melinda Gates announced that we were going to eradicate malaria, I don't think there was a malariologist in the room who wasn't close to heart attack. You know, the idea that you could just, if you had a lot of money, you could just say that and send an entire community in a given research direction because you were willing to pump hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars into it, which is so amazing and so unusual. And I don't think it was informed in any sense, let alone by a study of the past and inspiration from smallpox or something like that. I think it was just an idea that she had. It seemed like a really good idea to her at the time.
Well, it reminds you of Mary Lasker's selling the war on, what the war on cancer to Richard Nixon.
Sure.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the 1945 project? Is this something, the U.S. of course had just finished World War II, and been using DDT. Is this something they just thought, well, we got this good chemical, we can go in and wipe something out real quick?
It's a complicated story. It's rooted in the war itself. So with the Allied invasions of North Africa in '42, airspace was perilous over the North Atlantic. So the Americans decided that they were going to have to provide logistical support for the North African campaign from below the Sahara. So Americans flew to Brazil, and then from Brazil across the South Atlantic, and they were looking for air bases in West Africa. There were some, there was one in Accra, but they wanted another one. They wanted one in Liberia. And so in January of 1943, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt became the first U.S. president to visit Africa. And after going to North Africa, went down to Liberia to negotiate. He succeeded in acquiring the rights to build an airfield, Roberts Field, in Liberia. And the Liberians were able to extract a number of promises from FDR. One was in public health. It was not the first or second or third or fourth or perhaps even fifth item on the list, but the Americans bought in because it was of strategic importance for them during the war. So in the immediate aftermath of the war, the Americans went in there and started spreading some DDT around to see if they could solve the problem in Monrovia. And they had a house campaign, and it was not very successful because of these lateritic soils. Most of the houses were built from lateritic brick, and the iron apparently was sorptive and drew the insecticides into the interior of the brick rather than leaving them on the outside of the brick, so they found that they had to keep spraying. They were spraying 12 times a year. I mean, the costs were phenomenal. And then they expanded this to spraying the swamps around Liberia, but that didn't work out all that well. So they decided they needed to, as ever, scale up. It wasn't successful the first time. Tried on a larger scale. So they moved into the interior, and they had some successes, but then they made a turn toward dieldrin, which was a more dangerous and toxic compound, but which had an elevated knockdown rate, so to speak, for the mosquitoes inside the houses. And so there was a dieldrin campaign. And that dieldrin campaign went on for a number of years, and they were able to reduce the levels of infection in the dieldrin zone to very low levels. Later, they withdrew their commitment, and the Liberians, Togba in particular, leveraged the Americans in such a way that it was not entirely successful. But his threat was he was going to bring the WHO in if the Americans didn't step up. The Americans didn't step up and brought the WHO in. So the WHO then began a campaign in the upcountry, because this was part of the Liberian program to try and integrate the so-called African populations into the Americo-Liberian world. So that's kind of the history of that. It was rooted very much in the war effort and the commitment that the Americans had made during the war.
For people who don't know, Liberia was still at that time ruled by the American descendants, all the way to 1980.
Perhaps one more question, then we probably should call it a day.
I think the decision to intervene with residual insecticides or not also depends on the region. If we, as far as I know, if we face with stable malaria, means that transmission occurring the whole year and the local residents are under the pressure of transmission equally the whole year, throughout the year. So this could be challenging, because if we spray it and bring down the prevalence, and after a while we can't continue because of resistance or logistics or any financial problems or whatever, then the disease starts to boom up. And probably, I guess that the people will be very unhappy and complain, and next time you have very low chance to go back to the same region and do again the same to the people. You can do it once or twice, but not 10 times. But in the region with medium stability of malaria, that you don't have it over the year, that it's seasonal malaria actually, then the people don't have immunity because they are not under the pressure from parasites. So I guess in such a case, if we can bring down the number of cases, annual cases, it will be quite good. Because anyway, the people didn't have any sort of immunity. So if malaria comes, they get it. They're vulnerable.
Yeah.
And if you can help them in some seasons to bring the number of cases down, it could be helpful. So I mean, the attitude to decide intervene or not depends also on the region and what kind of malaria you have.
I agree with you. Although, you know, in areas where there is seasonal transmission, the acquisition of immunity takes place, you know, after a single challenge. And so it will not degrade entirely ever. You know, you never go back to an entirely non-immune status. So that there is immunity, even in these seasonal areas, and depending on the effective inoculation rate, you know, if it's 1, well, you're going to have some people who statistically are not bitten, you know, very frequently, only after many, many years. But when you have a higher rate, which is frequently the case, 10 to 15 or something, you're going to have people who have a bout of malaria every couple of years, and that's going to be enough to sustain a lot of the acquired immunity. I think that from my point of view, the compelling case for using synthetic insecticides with all of the environmental problems that come with them are to protect communities that are non-immune. So that when you have the threat of epidemic malaria, for example, moving into highland areas, then you're facing just devastation among non-immune populations, that's the time to go in with residual insecticides, and you can just stop the epidemic cold. You don't have to do it every year. You're just intervening to prevent massive, you know, loss of life and human suffering. And I think makes a very compelling case. And when you do it very infrequently, you're not going to produce resistance. In seasonal environments where you are spraying annually, you're going to produce resistance. So whenever you commit to a spraying program, it's time limited. You know, and so you say, okay, well, we'll be able to spray for 5 years or 6 years, or then we're going to get resistance. Well, you have to determine, well, what's your logic going? Why are you spraying for 6 years if you're going to produce resistance? What's the logic? What's the end game? You stop, and you have epidemic malaria taking place. So that this is what's so unsexy about malaria control, is that you have to commit to it for the long term, and it's imperfect.
On that note, which may be the perfect note, well, thank you, Jim.